The headlines are a lie. For 2 years, you were told the Black Sea was a frozen conflict, a contested stalemate. That illusion is dead. The West fundamentally failed to see the trap. Russia has just opened what I call the Odessa Corridor, and it is the single most decisive strategic defeat the West has suffered since 19. We are witnessing the opening of what I call the Odessa Corridor, a strategic move by Moscow that is not merely a tactical breakthrough, but a decisive high-stakes thrust against the economic and military heart of the remaining Ukrainian state. This is not about one city, nor is it about one port. It is the beginning of the endgame for Ukraine's maritime sovereignty, and by extension, a profound strategic defeat for the collective West. This analysis will not be the same shallow commentary you hear from the television talking heads. This is an assessment in the style of the strategic realist, the Macgregor doctrine, contextual, unforgivingly frank, and focused on the undeniable military and geopolitical facts on the ground. We will break down this operation, analyze the panic signals emanating from Brussels and Washington, and explain precisely why the opening of the Odessa Corridor is NATO's absolute worst nightmare realized. Prepare for a deep dive, because understanding the full implications of this development is critical to grasping the new reality of the 21st century balance of power. The recent development in Russian strategy is not merely a military action, it is an act of complex strategic brilliance. Russia has demonstrably asserted control over the crucial sea lanes approaching Odessa, effectively opening a de facto shipping corridor under its protection and establishing a forward operational perimeter on the western Black Sea coast. This move fundamentally alters the geography of the war. The question is not how they did it, but rather why Odessa? Why does this single objective hold such profound strategic and global importance? Odessa is not just a city, it is the last viable deep-water port controlled by Kyiv. Before the war, it, along with its neighboring ports of Chornomorsk and Pivdeny, handled the majority of Ukraine's exports, specifically the grain that feeds the global south and the steel that drives its industry. The Black Sea is a strategic crucible, and controlling its northwestern quadrant is like placing a tourniquet on the economic lifeblood of the Ukrainian state. By securing this corridor, Moscow is not just gaining a military foothold, it is seizing the power to regulate, restrict, or permit global food flows. This transforms a regional conflict into a lever of profound global influence. This move has fundamentally shifted the power projection dynamics of the entire Black Sea basin. The pressure is now not just on Kyiv, but on NATO members like Romania and Bulgaria, and most critically, Turkey, which controls the vital Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. This is a classic choke point strategy, where control over a small geographical area yields vast economic and political leverage. The immediate signals emanating from NATO, the quiet emergency sessions, the sudden shift in rhetoric from victory to stabilization, are revealing the panic. They now face a military reality they have consistently ignored: Russia's strategic depth and its ability to mass forces for a decisive theater-level objective. This operation was not accidental. It was the culmination of a patient, systematic buildup of supply lines, air superiority, and the neutralization of Ukrainian naval capabilities. This breakthrough is a direct consequence of a strategic vulnerability that has been centuries in the making. NATO leadership once again disregarded the enduring imperative of geography. They viewed Ukraine as a modern Western European state, while Russia viewed it as a centuries-old, essential geopolitical security zone on its southern periphery. This operation demonstrates precisely where Russia is willing to apply its military strength, where the results yield maximum strategic leverage. But to truly grasp the significance of this move, we must look beyond the present headlines and delve into the deep historical and geopolitical currents that make Odessa a prize of such unparalleled strategic value. We must examine the centuries-old motivations that forged Odessa into an imperial and geopolitical center in the next chapter. The importance of Odessa did not commence in 2022, nor did its strategic value simply emerge with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Its profound, non-negotiable significance for Moscow stretches back to the Novorossiya project conceived by Empress Catherine the Great. Following the conquest of the region from the Ottoman Empire in the late 18th century, Catherine founded Odessa in 7. The city was not an accidental settlement, it was a deliberate geopolitical creation, designed to serve as Russia's window to the west on a vital warm water port, a geographical imperative that has relentlessly defined Russian strategic thought for nearly 3 centuries. Consider the cold objective facts and historical figures that underpin this current crisis. For the better part of 2 centuries, Odessa stood as the 4th largest city of the Russian Empire, a cosmopolitan, commercially powerful hub. Its singular strategic function was to efficiently funnel the immense agricultural output, the grain of the vast fertile Russian steppe, onto the global market, providing both wealth and diplomatic leverage. It was an imperial jewel, a principal naval base, and the unquestioned center of Black Sea trade. The drive to control this entire littoral coastline from Crimea, annexed in 1783, all the way westward to the Dniester estuary, is not an arbitrary aspiration. It is a consistent centuries-old geopolitical and military objective. This imperative has been a central and bloody factor in every major conflict involving Russia, from the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War to the two World Wars. The modern intent was clearly articulated by Russian leadership early in the conflict. General Rustam Minnikhanov openly spoke of the comprehensive goal, establishing full control over southern Ukraine to create a contiguous land corridor. This corridor was planned to link not only the newly secured territories to Crimea but also to stretch further west, establishing a connection to the Russian-supported region of Transnistria in Moldova. This is not Russian expansionism as some vague ideological fantasy. It is the cold, hard military logic of securing economic necessity and achieving non-negotiable strategic depth, a logic which only the strategically blind would choose to ignore. This leads us to the critical strategic failure on the part of the West. Why did Western strategists fail so utterly to appreciate this core objective? Because fundamentally, Western strategists operate on a short-term, four-year election cycle, perpetually reactive to the most recent headline, while Moscow operates on a 400-year historical one, planning for enduring security. Western capitals saw Odessa as nothing more than a modern Ukrainian port that should remain free. Russia saw the unfinished business of the Black Sea Fleet, the necessary security of its southern flank, and the non-negotiable imperative of a warm water outlet. They conveniently forgot that the entire Black Sea strategic architecture, from the 1936 Montreux Convention restricting non-riparian navies to the perpetual naval contest with Turkey, revolves entirely around the control of littoral territory and key ports like Odessa. Without the decisive permanent security of Odessa, Crimea, Russia's historical naval fortress remains perpetually geopolitically exposed and vulnerable to interdiction. The current events, therefore, are simply the modern, brutal manifestation of this ancient struggle for control. While the loss of Kherson represented a tactical setback for Moscow, the retention of Odessa quickly became Kiev's primary strategic lifeline. By focusing almost exclusively on the localized attrition in the eastern Donbass, Western capitals fundamentally miscalculated Russia's overarching strategic priorities. This allowed Moscow the time, the space, and the operational freedom necessary to set the conditions for this crucial breakthrough on the coast. They assumed the war was merely about territory in the east, when in reality the enduring strategic center of gravity was the geo-economic control of the Black Sea littoral. This meticulous, patient, and historically informed setup now brings us directly to the operational environment and the precise strategic breakdown of how the Odessa Corridor was truly opened. What exactly transpired to achieve this decisive breakthrough? The establishment of the Odessa Corridor was not achieved by the single dramatic amphibious landing that Western analysts obsessively anticipated and planned against. Instead, it was the execution of a highly calculated squeeze play, a methodical strategy combining persistent long-range fires, crippling supply line interdiction, and deep strike attrition. This method exposed the fundamental flaws in Ukraine's defensive posture and NATO's logistical support model. The initial and perhaps most critical phase centered on neutralizing the logistical arteries that were essential for sustaining the Odessa region and supplying the remaining elements of the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet. The Russian strategic focus was not on occupying territory, but on achieving logistical starvation. This meant the systematic and relentless use of high-precision standoff weaponry, primarily the voluminous output of high-explosive glide bombs, FABs, and various cruise missile systems, targeting critical infrastructure. Strikes were aimed directly against railheads, large-scale storage depots, and most critically, the bridges and rail links connecting Odessa to the rest of Ukraine and to NATO's primary supply hubs situated in Romania. The repeated targeted striking of the Zatoka Bridge, which carries the vital coastal rail line toward the Romanian border, was an unmistakable signal of intent. Choke the supply lines, isolate the entire region, and render the deep water ports unusable for high-volume military shipments. This systematic effort degraded the resilience of the supply chain, turning the entire coastal defense zone into a logistical liability. In the maritime domain, the situation evolved from a contested stalemate to Russia's undeniable area denial dominance. While Ukrainian naval drones achieved notable tactical victories against certain Black Sea Fleet assets, they ultimately failed to negate Russia's foundational area denial capability. The Russian fleet, having learned harsh lessons, adapted. It began operating from protected anchorages, and crucially, reinforced its comprehensive air defense and long-range missile perimeter. By deploying long-range anti-ship and land attack missile systems with greater density, Moscow effectively pushed the active Ukrainian-controlled maritime zone back toward the shore. The result was not a conventional line of warships establishing a boundary, but a highly effective passive blockade turning active,
where the risk to commercial shipping and therefore the viability of trade became existentially prohibitive. The Black Sea was rendered a Russian firing zone, making independent maritime commerce unsustainable. The definitive operational pressure, however, came from the land. The sustained ongoing advances in the Eastern Theater, particularly the deep penetration near Pokrovsk and the systematic securing of key logistical roads, served a higher strategic purpose. They forced Kyiv to commit its absolute strategic reserves, the most experienced and elite brigades, into the grueling Donbass meat grinder. This was the trap. By fixing Kyiv's primary attention and most formidable forces hundreds of miles away in the east, Russia simultaneously stripped the defensive depth and readiness from the entire Odessa-Mykolaiv sector. This strategic deception rendered any sustained defense of the coastline brittle, undermanned, and strategically vulnerable. The ability to defend the coast was sacrificed for the political necessity of holding the Donbass line. The strategic significance of this successful squeeze play is profound and far-reaching. It definitively signals that Russia has achieved local military dominance in the northwestern Black Sea and controls the means of ingress and egress. The opening of the corridor means Russia can now unilaterally dictate the terms of trade, effectively denying Ukraine an estimated 25 to 30% of its total export revenue. This single maneuver transforms Odessa from Ukraine's last viable lifeline into an immediate, crippling economic and military liability for Kyiv. The economic and military leverage this confers is enormous, shifting the entire balance of power. The breakthrough now compels us to move beyond describing the events and immediately begin the critical process of analyzing the profound and immediate implications for the security guarantees and the long-term credibility of the entire Western alliance. The successful establishment of the Odessa Corridor, viewed through the lens of strategic realism, the unforgiving Macgregor doctrine, is not merely a Ukrainian tactical setback. It is a stunning, undeniable validation of Russia's methodical, attrition-based strategy, and far more critically, a stark indictment of NATO's catastrophic failure of deterrence and long-term strategic vision. The core analysis centers on this. The West substituted aggressive rhetoric for realistic military capability and resolve. NATO leaders promised unwavering support and the belief in Ukrainian victory, yet they consistently delivered a strategy of calibrated, restrictive assistance, providing just enough to keep them fighting, but never enough to win. This approach was fatally flawed, creating an unsustainable scenario of prolonged attrition that favored the larger, more industrially potent power. This strategy of calibrated failure collapsed on two fundamental levels, both of which led directly to the loss of maritime control. Firstly, the West became strategically myopic, obsessing over a ground war in the eastern Donbass, while critically neglecting the essential maritime and geo-economic pressure point, the Black Sea. As we discussed, control of the Black Sea is not a fringe issue. It is a non-negotiable strategic imperative for any major power in the region. By allowing Russia to systematically degrade Ukraine's ability to defend its coastline and its naval access through the relentless logistical squeeze, Chapter 3, NATO essentially greenlighted this final decisive maneuver. The long-range striking capability that decimated the coastal infrastructure was permitted to operate with impunity, as the necessary, theater-level air denial systems, like robust, widespread Patriot networks, were never delivered in the required volume or early enough to matter. The failure was not in tactics but in priorities. Secondly, the conflict ultimately reverted to an industrial contest, a truth that Douglas Macgregor has long emphasized. Russia's capacity for high-volume, cost-effective production of artillery ammunition, drones, and crucially glide bombs and cruise missiles, a reflection of its mobilized and retooled industrial base, simply overwhelmed the trickle of high-cost specialized Western systems. Western industrial output remained fundamentally on a peacetime footing, unable to meet the needs of a sustained large-scale attrition war. The West's focus on complex, bespoke weaponry proved inadequate against the sheer mass and persistence of Russian output. This disparity was exploited perfectly in the coastal strategy, where a constant, overwhelming volume of fire was used to achieve logistical paralysis. The ability to win a sustained war lies in the factory floors, not just the front lines, and the collective West was found profoundly unprepared. The implications for NATO are now existential. The threat perception has escalated sharply from a regional conflict contained within Ukraine's borders to a direct, immediate challenge to the security and sovereignty of NATO's southeastern flank. The Black Sea, now functionally a Russian-controlled lake, forces NATO member states like Romania and Bulgaria to stare directly across a newly militarized maritime border. This new reality confirms that Russia has secured its new southern borders, gained decisive economic leverage over global commodity markets, and simultaneously exposed the deep strategic overextension and industrial weakness that plagues the Western alliance. The strategic consequences extend to the principle of deterrence itself. When Moscow sees Western red lines move repeatedly, when it observes the industrial base failing to back up political promises, the belief in NATO's collective security wanes. The successful opening of the corridor confirms to Moscow that the West is incapable of or unwilling to sustain the necessary level of commitment to reverse a major strategic initiative. If this is the consequence of failing to deter Russia from achieving a critical coastal objective, we must now turn our attention to the potential future risks. What are the plausible escalation scenarios and potential outcomes as Moscow moves to solidify this massive strategic gain, and what options remain for a cornered NATO? The successful establishment of the Odessa Corridor is not an endpoint. It is the genesis of a series of highly plausible and increasingly alarming future outcomes that the NATO alliance must now urgently confront. This maneuver dictates a new strategic reality, forcing the escalation ladder to be reassessed by every capital from Washington to Bucharest. The question is no longer if the situation is contained, but how far Moscow is willing to press its advantage and where the West might finally draw a credible line. The political and strategic humiliation for NATO is already acute, creating immense domestic pressure in Western capitals to do something, a rash escalatory reflex that could be more dangerous than calculated inaction. Russia, leveraging its dominance, now has the initiative, and the plausible scenarios are deeply concerning. In this scenario, Russia consolidates its control over the Odessa Corridor without launching a massive, costly urban assault to seize the city itself. Moscow achieves 90% of its strategic goals by maintaining an absolute maritime blockade and sustained air superiority over the ports of Odessa, Chornomorsk and Pivdeny. This strategy creates a de facto annexation of Ukraine's entire maritime economy. The war shifts into a frozen conflict defined by maritime dominance, where Ukraine is permanently deprived of its most vital trade arteries. This outcome achieves critical economic leverage, securing Russia's southern flank and proving the Black Sea is under its operational control, all without incurring the massive logistical or human cost of protracted street fighting. The resulting state for Kiev is one of economic dependency and perpetual vulnerability. With the coastal flank now secured and logistics flowing, Russia turns its attention to a long-hinted-at objective, linking up with the internationally unrecognized Russian-backed region of Transnistria in Moldova. A full land corridor link-up becomes a low-risk operational objective from the newly secured coastal perimeter. This maneuver would achieve two critical ends, securing the entire southwestern flank of Novorossiya and simultaneously directly challenging the sovereignty of Moldova. By pushing the conflict right up to the Romanian and therefore NATO border, Moscow drastically shrinks the strategic buffer zone, putting immense and immediate pressure on an already fractured NATO consensus regarding Article 5 commitments and response timelines. The crisis rapidly shifts from Ukraine to the stability of Eastern Europe as a whole. The most perilous and potentially catastrophic scenario involves a conventional miscalculation by NATO in a desperate attempt to break the established blockade. Should NATO deploy its own naval assets or advanced offensive systems like Patriot batteries or F-16s directly into the Odessa region with the explicit aim of securing commercial shipping, an operation Macgregor has long cautioned against, it would instantly create the kind of direct engagement the alliance has sought to avoid. The Black Sea would transform into the flashpoint for a potential exchange between Russian long-range missile salvos aimed at neutralizing the new NATO presence and advanced Western air defenses. Such an engagement carries the inherent high risk of rapid, uncontrollable escalation, potentially involving conventional strikes on targets deep inside Russian-held territory or even Russian territory itself. The underlying risk here is the psychological one. The depth of the strategic humiliation for NATO is so acute that the political incentive to act recklessly to restore credibility could lead to an imprudent escalatory move. Escalation is not always a calculated choice. It can be the unintended consequence of mismanaging profound strategic defeat. The question is not if NATO is prepared to act, but whether it is prepared to accept the global and human impact of an action that, if it fails to meet the strategic requirement, could ignite a firestorm. The Black Sea is now a zone of direct competition, and the stakes could not be higher. We must now analyze the cascading global and human impact of these outcomes, looking beyond the immediate military geography to see how this fundamental shift will redraw the geopolitical map. The successful execution of the Odessa Corridor maneuver unleashes consequences that are not confined to the immediate battle space. The military dominance achieved in the northwestern Black Sea now has immediate, devastating repercussions that ripple across NATO, the global economy, and the lives of millions, fundamentally redrawing the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean basin. On a geopolitical level, the dominance of the Black Sea profoundly alters the security calculus of every surrounding nation. Turkey, a crucial NATO member and the region's historical naval power, is immediately placed in an agonizing strategic dilemma. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, ever the astute and often ruthless pragmatist, sees his country's strategic position severely challenged. The Turkish Straits, Bosporus and Dardanelles, governed by the Montreux Convention, grant Turkey immense power, but that power is diminished if the entire northern third of the sea is effectively controlled by Russia. Ankara will be forced to engage with Moscow on new, less favorable terms regarding maritime traffic, security and trade, further exposing the fault lines and conflicting national interests within the NATO alliance itself. This shift weakens the cohesion of the most strategically important alliance in the world. Furthermore, the frontline NATO states, Romania and Bulgaria, will demand massive, permanent and immediate NATO reinforcements. Their shared border with the contested Black Sea is now a zone of direct, perpetual Russian threat projection. The cost for NATO, financially and operationally, will skyrocket.
turning the Black Sea littoral into a permanently hyper-militarized zone of great power tension, requiring resources that NATO's already strained industrial base can ill afford to provide. The human and economic impact for Ukraine and the global south is staggeringly immediate. The loss of Odessa as a free and viable deep-water export hub is projected by leading economists to cause a steep drop, potentially 25% or more, in Ukraine's added value GDP and its primary source of foreign currency revenue. This financial strangulation directly impacts Kiev's ability to fund its defense, maintain social services, and ultimately survive as an independent, functioning state. Odessa was the country's last true economic lifeline. Crucially, the global food security implications are devastating. The Ukrainian grain that stabilized markets and fed millions in vulnerable nations across North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia will now be subject to Russian control, regulation, or will be forced onto expensive, inefficient, and logistically fragile land and river routes through Europe. Food leverage, the geopolitical instrument of soft power and diplomatic pressure, is now firmly and powerfully in Moscow's hands. This tool can be wielded for diplomatic gain in the developing world, allowing Russia to effectively circumvent Western sanctions by positioning itself as the guarantor of food supply, while painting the West as the source of global instability. Finally, we must consider the human toll, which, while often framed emotionally, has a crucial strategic outcome. The coastal cities now under threat face heightened bombardment and the psychological trauma of siege. Civilian stories will once again be tied directly back to strategic outcomes. The constant missile strikes will drive internal displacement and increase the migration burden on Western nations. Crucially, the realization that years of Western financial and military investment failed to secure Ukraine's most critical economic asset will breed profound strategic fatigue and doubt in Western capitals. This fatigue is a strategic victory for Moscow, validating its belief that patience and attrition can outlast democratic political will. This operation, therefore, is a strategic masterclass in exploiting geopolitical weakness, turning a regional war into a lever of global consequence. The long-term impact is the de facto recognition of a new massive Russian territorial and maritime security zone. The West's vision of a post-Cold War non-Russian-dominated Black Sea is officially and conclusively over. This forces us to ask the final urgent question: what are the key takeaways from this profound shift, and what is the final urgent strategic warning that must be delivered to a Western audience still grappling with the brutal realities of great power competition? The strategic maneuver that has opened the Odessa Corridor is a moment of profound clarity, slicing through the years of political posturing and flawed assumptions. It forces us to strip away the idealism and confront the brutal, enduring realities of 21st century great power competition. This is the time for a cold, unsentimental recap of the critical takeaways and a final urgent warning. Let's summarize the three undeniable strategic truths revealed by this operation. The opening of the Odessa Corridor is far more than a territorial gain. It is a decisive move to secure Russia's long-sought-after warm water access and establish unchallengeable economic and military control over the northwestern Black Sea. This maneuver irrevocably alters the geopolitical map, turning the Black Sea into a functionally Russian lake and ending the post-Cold War Western vision for the region. This success confirms the catastrophic failure of NATO's strategy of limited drip-fed support. The West prioritized short-term political narratives over long-term industrial and logistical commitment. Russia's methodical, attrition-based approach, exploiting its industrial base and geographical leverage, was allowed to succeed by a Western alliance that substituted wishful thinking for military reality. The crucial lesson is, deterrence must be backed by both capability and credible will. The operational risk has now decisively shifted to NATO's southeastern flank. The Black Sea littoral is no longer a buffer zone but a zone of direct competition. This raises the distinct immediate possibility of an inadvertent or intentional direct engagement as cornered Western powers try to contest the new hardened status quo. The threat of a direct confrontation between Russian long-range fires and NATO assets has never been higher. The most insidious cost of this Russian success is the permanent erosion of NATO's military credibility in the eyes of Moscow and increasingly in the eyes of the global South. When political red lines are repeatedly crossed without decisive military response, the belief in collective security wanes. Russia's successful strategy validates its conviction that patience, strategic depth, and industrial mobilization can effectively outlast the democratic political cycle and the fragmented political will of the West. This victory is as much psychological as it is physical. This also fuels strategic fatigue in the West. Years of financial investment, political capital, and military aid have culminated not in a victory, but in the loss of Ukraine's most vital economic asset. This realization undermines public support and deepens divisions between members of the alliance. I urge you to consider the deep structural implications of this new reality. What specific industrial measures must NATO take right now to re-establish a credible deterrent? Is a painful negotiated settlement recognizing the new geographical facts the only path forward to prevent a wider escalation? Or must the West commit to an all-in effort to contest the Black Sea? Share your considered strategic and unsentimental opinions in the comments below.
My final word, delivered with the unforgiving realism of the strategic analyst, is a necessary and urgent warning. Great powers do not fight wars for fleeting ideals. They fight for geography, for resources, and for enduring strategic security. Russia has secured an enduring, critical strategic gain. The current political class in the West must now confront the agonizing truth that their policy of prolonged, restrained conflict has failed to defeat Moscow. Worse, it has actively created the conditions that paved the way for its most decisive and permanent strategic success. The Black Sea is now the crucible of the New World Order, and its flames threaten to consume the carefully constructed post-Cold War security architecture.